So in this very short screencast, I just want to review some initial evidence on the demand for leisure time taken from a number of different countries. So the first thing I want to look at is just trends in annual hours of work since the end of the 19th century. So what we can see in the end of the 19th century are, and this looks at France, the Netherlands and the US. They're picking up different points in time because this is when the data is available. The reference you can see down at the bottom of the slide here. But what we can see here is the kind of Victorian, if you like, late 19th century industrial system. So you have the factory system, and you have typically 6-day weeks, 12-hour shifts, and a very high proportion of the population doing those kinds of hours. So we are literally talking about 80-hour weeks that individuals are often working. So 70 to 80 hours is the norm in this period. Now, obviously, there was legislation to avoid worker exploitation, the growth of the trade union movement, and this put pressure on employers, or capital if you like, to reduce the number of hours to increase employee rights. So a reduction in working hours, a reduction in the lengths of shifts, and an increase in the amount of holiday that was offered. So what we can see here is, if we look at the three blue lines, the blue which is the US, the red which is the Netherlands, and the green which is France, we can see that between the end of the 19th century and the kind of pre-war period, or through the 1930s, we can see a very rapid reduction in hours of work. And what we see then from the 1950s, 60s onwards is something of a divergence. So initially we saw across all three countries, and I recognise that these countries are Western, industrialising at the same point, going through some of the same kind of processes. This will be different for economies in different parts of the world. So typically in Africa and South Asia and Southeast Asia, this curve would look quite different. But this is the data that we have going back over this period. But what we can see around the 1950s, 1960s is a divergence between the US and France and the Netherlands. So in France and the Netherlands, we can see a continuing decrease in the number of hours worked. Okay. And what we can also see is that, the per capita sums are not too different. So at the bottom here, we've got the GDP per capita, right? So we've got the wealth of the countries. So we can see that America is wealthier than both France and the Netherlands in terms of GDP per capita in 2000. But not massively so. But what we can see is that incomes have continued to rise in all three countries. So here we see the scale is increasing, and we see that up to this point, we're seeing probably what could be described as an income effect in all three countries, i.e., as GDP per capita, as incomes rise, so the demand for leisure time, for non-work time, actually increases. But what we can see in the US from the 1950s is that this actually reverses to some extent, and then is steady. So, in the post-war period, the second half of the 20th century, we didn't really see a significant decline in annual hours worked in the US. So in the US, we're seeing the kind of substitution and income effects essentially cancelling each other out, and there not being any real overall decline in annual hours worked. Whereas in France and the Netherlands, based on this evidence, we can see that it is actually the income effect which is winning out. And as incomes rise in France and the Netherlands, the evidence is that individuals are choosing more leisure time. So as a society, as a country, France and the Netherlands are, the income effect is stronger than the substitution effect. And the net effect of that is an increase in time away from work, some of which will be leisure time. So this scatter plot shows us a relationship between GDP per capita on the left-hand axis and average hours of free time per worker. And what we can see here is that the countries that have got a lower GDP, so Mexico, Chile, Greece, also have a lower level of free time. So their free time per year is lower than countries who are at the top end of the GDP per capita scale. So we see Norway, Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, France here having relatively high levels of GDP per capita, but also enjoying more free time per worker. Okay. And interestingly as well, we can see what we saw in the last diagram. We can see that there is some distance between the Netherlands, who have a similar kind of GDP per capita level to the USA, but they enjoy roundabout, so if this is about just under 7,000 hours of free time for the US worker, and the Netherlands is nearly 7,400, we can see that, the Dutch worker enjoys around 8 hours more free time per week than the US worker or the US citizen. Yeah? And this is part of our consideration of the substitution effect being stronger in the United States than it is in Holland. The other thing that this shows us is we can draw a kind of almost a straight line through this, or there's a strong link between GDP per capita and average hours of free time, which shows us that the richer the country, the more likely it is to enjoy more hours of free time. So the general picture here is that the income effect generally is stronger than the substitution effect. And we have some countries, although we have some countries which are some way distance away from this line, including the United States. And in the United States, GDP per capita is high, but the hours of free time are lower than, Norway, the Netherlands, Denmark, Germany, who are in the kind of same territory in terms of GDP per capita. So, but what this shows us overall is that, leisure is a normal good, that sport as a leisure time activity is a normal good, in terms of as incomes increase, so the demand for leisure time and sport actually increases as well. So we can see as industrialization happens, as economic development happens, and this is true in countries like India and China, and as GDP raises, so demand for sport actually increases too. So this is where some of this information becomes useful. And the other thing I just wanted to point out is when we come to look at the UK or Great Britain, and an evidence for Great Britain in terms of hours worked, and whether we've got a substitution or income effect. The UK is a bit of an outlier these days. What has happened in the British economy over the last decade or so is very strange. So here this is a source from the Financial Times from a few years ago now. But what this shows us is that some countries we've got economic and wages contraction. So we can see Italy and Portugal where GDP, so this axis here is GDP, and this is negative GDP growth, and this is positive GDP growth. We can see that Italy and Portugal, for example, GDP in those countries actually decreased. Yeah. Here we've got, on this axis, we've got real wages growth rate increasing. And what we can see is that most other advanced G7, G12, G15 economies have actually seen an increase in wages, but the UK is alone in having low wage growth, in fact negative wage growth. So, this is going to affect the UK and the picture in the UK, because for the last decade we haven't seen wages actually increase. So this will be interesting to look at in terms of what does this mean? Does this mean that the price of leisure therefore is cheaper? Therefore there should be an increase in leisure time and a decrease in time at work? Or does it mean the opposite? Does it mean that to maintain incomes, workers in the UK are increasing their working hours, and so we're not seeing an increase in leisure time? So we'll need to think about that when we come to look at the UK picture. But that's what I wanted to talk about in general terms, and I've hinted at there's something different happening in America. So in Screencast 3, I want to come back and look at the concept of the overworked American, and why is it that America seems to be choosing work over leisure? Why is it that the substitution effect in America seems to be stronger, and what additional evidence is there for this?